Morning, everybody. So this is actually being done as a webinar, which means normally the way that Zoom works is that everybody has an opportunity to, everyone is on their cameras and can speak. But because this is a webinar, any questions that you have or anything that you're curious about, you want to put that either in the chat, or there's also at the bottom, you can see there's a button that says, I think it's Q&A. So if you click Q&A, you can actually put in a question, and then I will try to address that question while we're going. Let me just quickly turn off my notifications. Let's see. Okay, all right, great. Okay, so before we get started, there's a couple things that I want to talk about. Number one is this class is actually presented by Assistant Editors Bootcamp. Assistant Editors Bootcamp is a program that I and a colleague of mine, Connor, started back in 2007. We've been doing it for, I guess, about 5 years now. We started out doing in-person classes, but with the pandemic, we sort of switched to more of a remote model of doing webinars similar to this one that I'm doing now. Most of the time, we do a combination of presentation and actual working within the program. But the way that I designed this class is almost entirely a presentation. Towards the end, I'll be going through and answering any questions with like practically within Media Composer, but pretty much the entire thing is formatted as a presentation. And the reason that I did that is because I want it to be very clear what I know that when I'm trying to understand something, it helps me to see all of that information laid out visually as bullet points, and sort of broken down instead of someone just talking something through. So I wanted to present the information in a way that was sort of succinct and easy to understand, even if you weren't paying close attention. So along with that, I also wanted to mention that the topic of this class, I feel, is very underserved. There's not a lot of information out there about Media Composer and the changes that happen, or the changes in new versions of macOS. So I've tried to make the class fit as broad an audience as possible, which means that there's a lot of information in here that for an editor who's just starting out might be a little bit overwhelming, or might seem like overkill. But I've also tried to simplify that information by adding in like little recap slides to sort of tell you what the important points are of what I've gone over. And, you know, the information, if you're, let's say, like a VFX editor, and you really need to go in depth with this information, I've included hopefully everything that you would need to understand it. But if you're, you know, an editor that only works on one project at a time and never brings in their own media, I've also tried to simplify it with slides that sort of give you what you need to know to get your job done. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is that this information, so it was asked by Craig, will this be recorded? Yes, it's being recorded right now. And it will actually be available on the Assistant Editors Bootcamp website afterwards. It's a free class. I personally just think it's really important that I get this information out there, because as I said before, I feel like it's really important. It's really valuable information, and there's just not too many people out there who have a succinct layout of all of the information regarding the changes in Media Composer. So yes, it will be available for free on the Assistant Editors Bootcamp. It was also asked, will you guys receive the slides? Normally, I would say no. With our classes, I try to keep all of the slides just because I feel like it's important. But with this class, again, because I feel like this information is so scarce, if you send me an email and request it, I can send you the slide deck as a PDF. So yes, the slides will be available. And as I said before, pretty much everything that I'm saying is covered in the slideshow. So if you have the slides, you have pretty much all of the information that I'm covering. So I'm going to mark those as answered. Okay. All right. So I actually started working. I checked yesterday when I created this slideshow. I actually started working on this slideshow back in, I think, about 3 years ago in 2019. And I had sort of been working on it here and there, but it never really felt like something that was in high demand. Because as with any software, people are usually staying a couple versions behind on Media Composer, and it really takes time for things to build up to the point where everyone is sort of ready to move on to the next thing. And over the past 6 months or so, I've really felt like, you know, with Apple's switch to ARM processors, and you know, the fact that we're now almost, I guess, about 4 years out from Media Composer 2018, when Avid switched to the new interface. I feel like people are sort of, we're sort of reaching an inflection point where people really feel, you know, like they need to figure out what the next step is. And as you'll see in the presentation, things have changed significantly in the newer versions of Media Composer on macOS. And I felt like now was a really good time to get this information out there while people were looking for it, while people were making that switch, so that everybody could sort of understand, you know, what's changed, what they're getting themselves into, and, you know, how to make the switch as painless as possible, and really how to be more efficient with, you know, the loss of some of the functionality that was available previously. So Christian asked, how soon do I think the transition to Apple Silicon will occur as far as post goes? It's an interesting point, and I was actually thinking about it yesterday, because I feel like in some way the industry has sort of settled on the Mac Pro, the trash can Mac Pro, as the system of choice for the past several years. And what I find particularly interesting is that machine's not even the current Mac Pro anymore, but nobody really bought the Tower Mac Pro. And I think that's just because it was too expensive. And in some ways, I think that the recently released Mac Studio is more the successor to the trash can Mac Pro. And because of that, I've spoken to a couple different rental companies, and it seems like a lot of them are feeling that the Mac Studio is sort of the way forward. I believe I know there will be a Apple Silicon Mac Pro, but I really think that as video editors, of course this is debatable, but a lot of the functionality that we used to need to get from a Mac Pro, we don't need anymore. Most editors don't use PCI cards, and if they do, you know, there's options with Thunderbolt, and it's just, there's a lot that you can do in a little box that 10, 15 years ago, you had to have a tower to do. So I think that the Mac Studio is sort of going to take over. The amount of time that I think that'll take, I would say definitely within the next 2 years, but we'll see. And I think that a lot of the reason why this transition has been sort of rocky is because of what I'm going to be covering in this presentation, that people look at the situation and it just seems like too much of a headache to deal with, and they just put off the transition. Not to mention the new interface. The new interface is sort of something that I won't be talking about too much in this presentation, but that's also a big hurdle. Okay, any more questions before I get started? Okay, great. All right, so let's get started. And I think we're gonna, I never timed this presentation, but I'm guessing we're gonna come in at about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then, as I said before, once I finish the actual presentation portion, if anybody has any further questions that they'd actually like to see me address within Media Composer, I have Media Composer up as well and can run through anything. And then the last piece of information, I'm not sure if I already said this, but all of the info that I'm presenting is based on Media Composer 2022.7, which is the current version. So if you're on an older version of Media Composer, some of the information that I say may not pertain to that version, because things change very quickly with versions of Avid. So if I say something and you're like, I can't do that in my version of Avid, it's likely that it's been added since the version you're using. But you can always ask me if you're curious, maybe when that feature or function was changed, or something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a screen share. Okay, can everybody see the presentation slides? Can someone just respond quickly so I can confirm? Great, okay. All right, so we're going to be talking about Media Composer and modern macOS, and specifically the removal of QuickTime and Title Tool and what they mean for your workflow. All right, so an overview of the class. I'm going to be talking about what QuickTime is and why it doesn't work anymore, the effect that has on Media Composer, the loss of the Title Tool and how you can get around that or deal with that, navigating the changes, making the most of a world without QuickTime, and then backwards compatibility. All right, so let's start off talking a little bit about QuickTime. This whole presentation is very Apple heavy, and for obvious reasons, we're talking about Apple hardware and software. But when we talk about QuickTime, you've probably heard that Media Composer doesn't work with QuickTime anymore. And I find that one of the biggest misconceptions is people don't understand what that means. What does that mean? That you can't use QuickTime files anymore? Or does that mean that macOS can't use QuickTime Player and QuickTime Pro anymore? Or does that mean that QuickTime Player in modern macOS doesn't work? Or does that mean that the QuickTime framework doesn't work? There are 4 different things that are referred to as QuickTime. 2 of them are no longer functional in macOS, and 2 of them are still completely intact. So QuickTime Player 7 and QuickTime Pro no longer work in macOS, and the QuickTime framework, which Avid's export, import, and linking engines were all based on, no longer works in modern versions of macOS. The QuickTime container, however, which means MOV files, are completely unaffected. You can still view, edit, do everything with QuickTime files at the macOS level, and the QuickTime player in modern macOS the one that has the icon you can see in this slide, is totally intact. You can still use it. It's still there. But you'll understand a little better how this situation came to be when we talk about a little bit of history. So if we look back at the history of QuickTime, so QuickTime was actually introduced by Apple in 1991, and it was really before video on computers was common. And QuickTime was basically a way to play back, encode, and decode video. So at the time, I'm old enough, I suppose, to remember when computers and video were completely separate worlds. And QuickTime in 1991 was really sort of the first consumer level way to deal with video on a computer. And this was the icon, and it was particularly great because it supported common video codecs, but it could also be expanded with additional third-party codecs. This was the interface. Obviously, it looks pretty dated now. And not only did Apple release it as a player, but Apple also released a framework. So there was a player and a framework for both macOS and Windows. So you could play back video, but third parties could also build that video playback, encoding, and exporting into their software, and it could run on both macOS and Windows. So you can imagine that companies at the time who were building video editing software saw this as an opportunity, because there was really no other viable way to do it. And because of that, many NLEs like Media Composer, Premiere, base their playback, import, and export engines on the QuickTime framework. So if we look at the QuickTime framework itself, it's very flexible, and it allows for files like a QuickTime reference, which is basically an empty container that has pointers to files in different places on a system. So if you create a QuickTime reference file, and you've got 3 files on one drive, and then 3 files on another drive, and then 3 files on another drive, that reference will, when you export it, will still be referring to all of those files. It's not self-contained, which is a pretty crazy and cool idea when you think about it. And the reason that you could have a QuickTime reference is because the QuickTime framework supported multiple video tracks in a single file. So, and if you ever worked with QuickTime 7 or QuickTime Pro, which were actually the same thing, then you might remember you could actually go into the movie properties and you could see when there were multiple instances of a video track. You could add video tracks, you could put clips together, you could do all kinds of cool stuff in QuickTime that was really not possible anywhere else. So because of that, that flexibility, and actually there's a little more to the story here. It was I read about this over the past couple of days, but Microsoft was actually trying to get Apple to remove QuickTime from Windows. They really wanted it. They wanted to create their own playback engine, and Apple wasn't interested in doing that. But third parties more and more also wanted playback on Windows, and so they sort of stopped supporting the functions in QuickTime that were more advanced. And so Apple decided that the best way to show the capabilities of QuickTime and sort of the way forward was to create their own software. So Final Cut Pro, the first 7 versions at least, were actually based on the QuickTime framework. Also many helpful cross-platform utilities like MPEG Streamclip, Qt Change were based on the QuickTime framework as well. And that's just because it was so flexible. There was all kinds of things that you could do with it. And it was really easy to get your hooks into it because it was so open, and it so widely supported, third-party development. So this brings us up to about like 2007, 2006, 2007. Apple had created all of these versions of Final Cut. It started out sort of a niche piece of software, but Final Cut was revolutionary in that it sort of allowed you to work with more high-end video without all the overhead of the expensive hardware that something like an Avid would require. And so QuickTime really became, quite an asset. But when looking at the QuickTime framework, when designing the iPhone, because when they were designing the iPhone, Apple really had to decide, because they needed video playback of some kind, they really had to decide, do we want to bring QuickTime to the iPhone, or do we want to try, something a little different? So when looking at QuickTime, Apple felt that it was sort of bloated because it had Windows support, which was a lot of overhead that was arguably at this point maybe not needed. And it had support for legacy codecs going all the way back to 1991. So, early codecs that no one used anymore were still, part of QuickTime, and they sort of had to decide whether that was an important thing to keep supporting. And in addition to that, QuickTime at this point was sort of outdated. It was 32-bit, which I'll talk about in a little while. It was single-threaded, which means if you have a computer with multiple cores, QuickTime would only be able to use a single one of those cores when it was doing encoding or something else. It didn't really have the GPU acceleration needed for H.264, and it didn't have any color management. So these were all sort of things, when looking towards the future, Apple felt like, maybe it was sort of time to move on and build something new from the ground up that was more forward-looking than QuickTime. So in 2007, the iPhone was released, and it actually, instead of QuickTime, it used a new video engine called AV Foundation. And AV Foundation is still used today. AV Foundation is 64-bit, but it doesn't allow third-party codecs or QuickTime reference files. And it's also far less open than the QuickTime framework, and it has no Windows support. But because it's 64-bit and because it was built from the ground up within the last 15 years, it's much faster and it has a much more modern code base. So at the time, AV Foundation was really only on the iPhone. And so in 2007, 2008, Macs were still completely QuickTime. That changed in 2009 with the release of macOS Snow Leopard, which introduced a new version of QuickTime Player called QuickTime Player 10, which was based on AV Foundation instead of QuickTime. In the early versions of QuickTime 10, there was actually a translation layer, which I didn't think was important to include, but basically you could play stuff through QuickTime through the QuickTime framework in the early versions of QuickTime Player, but that eventually got dropped. And then 2 years later, in 2011, Final Cut Pro 10, which was not particularly well received at the time, was also based on AV Foundation. And Apple actually moved on from QuickTime pretty quickly and deprecated it in 2011 in favor of AV Foundation. So if you're not familiar with software, the concept of deprecation basically means that something is still there. So the QuickTime framework was still going to be there in future versions of macOS, but Apple would not be adding to it. They would not continue working on it. And that it basically means that there's no guarantee that the next version of macOS will include support for the QuickTime framework. So that's what deprecation means. So the QuickTime 7 and the QuickTime framework were still supported, but they actually required a separate download. So if you installed macOS between 2000, I guess about 2011 and 2017-ish, you may have had to download the QuickTime player or QuickTime 7. And the reason for that was because it was no longer part of the operating system, and it had become a separate download. But that lasted for a long time. There was support for the QuickTime framework in the operating system, even though Apple had moved on to AV Foundation. So why did this change? So to understand why this changed, we have to look at something called 32-bit versus 64-bit computing. So in computing, processes, operating systems, and applications can either be 32-bit or 64-bit. And what that determines is the amount of RAM that can be used by an application. So a 32-bit application can only use up to 4 gigabytes of RAM, whereas a 64-bit app can use up to 16 exabytes, which is 16 billion gigabytes. It'll be a while before we hit the limitations of 64-bit. 16 billion gigabytes of RAM. So that's a lot of RAM. So macOS transitioned to 64-bit with 10.6 Snow Leopard in 2009, but it continued to run 32-bit apps through a translation layer. Because if you're running a 64-bit OS, you can run 32-bit apps, but it has to be done through a translation layer because they're not native apps anymore. So for a long time, macOS ran 32-bit apps without a problem through that translation layer. But with the transition to Apple Silicon, Apple didn't want to write a translation layer on top of the translation layer that they were already writing for the Intel to Apple Silicon switch, just for outdated applications. So they were already writing this translation layer called Rosetta, which is what we use to run Intel software on our new Apple Silicon Macs. But they didn't want to have to write on top of that another translation layer so that you could run 32-bit apps in addition to your 64-bit apps, because that was just additional work for, as I said before, outdated applications, arguably outdated applications. So I'm going to go a little bit off the rails for a moment, just because there's a lot of versions of macOS, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of names and versions at you. So I'm going to quickly put up a slide that everybody can either screenshot or just sort of get in your mind of all of the macOS versions and when they came out. So if you look here, we basically have a new release of macOS every year since 2011. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you'll also notice that there's one at the bottom that you may not have heard of, which is macOS 13 Ventura. Ventura is not out yet. It was actually announced by Apple back in June last month, and it will be released this fall. So the next hurdle, we're talking about Avid, so the next hurdle in Avid support and versions will be once macOS Ventura comes out. But I just wanted to give you sort of an idea of what all the releases have been, and put them chronologically so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, and have a little bit of context. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about 32-bit support. So as I said, Apple needed to move on from 32-bit because they decided that they wanted to make a switch to using their own processors, Apple Silicon, and they didn't want to bring over 32-bit support. So they had to sort of phase out 32-bit in the lead up to that transition. So in 2017, Apple told developers that macOS 10.13 High Sierra would be the last version that would run 32-bit apps without compromise. In 2018, 10.14 Mojave was announced as the last version to support 32-bit code. And they made this very clear. I remember I'm kind of a geek, and I watched some of the sessions, and they talked about how QuickTime should, you should quickly move away from QuickTime because this is the last version of Mac OS that's going to support it. And they even, in the later versions of Mojave, added this little dialogue when you would open up 32-bit applications to say that the application wasn't optimized for your Mac, and then that it needs to be updated by its developer. So that was 2018. In 2019, macOS 10.15 Catalina was released with absolutely no support for 32-bit apps or 32-bit code. So you might say, I mean, isn't that kind of like a short period of time? They told people 1 year, and then 2 years later they took it out. Yeah, sort of. I mean, it is a pretty quick timeline, but you also have to consider that Apple had moved the entire operating system over to 64-bit in 2009, and had deprecated at least QuickTime in 2011. So the writing had been on the wall for a while. It's just that Apple hadn't really said specifically when support would end until 2017. So because of that, 32-bit apps and processes like the QuickTime framework no longer work in macOS Catalina and later. So what about third-party developers? So most developers have been preparing for this. As I said before, the writing had been on the wall. Apple had said in 2009 that they were moving away from 32-bit, and then in 2017 they had said that 32-bit support for 32-bit apps was going to be going away soon. So most developers had sort of prepared for that. And I'm not throwing shade on Avid at all, but Media Composer still used 32-bit code for QuickTime in macOS and Windows for importing and exporting and linking to MOV and MP4, and the title tool in Media Composer was still 32-bit. So a large portion of the functionality in Avid in 2019, when Apple released macOS Catalina, was still dependent on 32-bit architecture. And because of that, usually it takes probably about between 2 and 4 months for Avid to release a new version of Media Composer that's compatible with the new version of macOS. With the switch to Catalina, it took Avid significantly longer because they had to add functionality that would replace all of this missing functionality that had required 32-bit apps. And the version that they released was Media Composer 2020.4, which came out in April of 2020. So that's about 7 months later. So it took a little longer than usual. And in Media Composer 2020.4, Avid replaced most of the QuickTime dependencies with a new engine that they wrote themselves called the Universal Media Engine. And I'm just going to refer to it as UME because that's what they refer to it as well. But UME is 64-bit, and it's now used by default in Media Composer 2020.4 and later for linking to MOV MP4 files and also for exporting. But, and here's the big asterisk that sort of looms over the entire situation. The importing engine in Media Composer continues to use the QuickTime framework for video and some types of audio. And because of that, you can't import video on the newer versions of macOS because the framework that is being used to try to import that video just isn't there. And I'll talk more about that extensively. And along with this, Titler Plus, which had actually been added in Media Composer 2018.12, was offered as an alternative to the title tool. So this is on the Mac side. So what about 32-bit on Windows? So on Windows, The operating system continues to run 32-bit apps without a problem. And the reason for that is that Microsoft has chose to handle the situation very differently from Apple. Apple, in making the switch to Apple Silicon, is actually switching from the x86 architecture of Intel to the ARM architecture of their Apple Silicon chips. And in that switch, as I said, they didn't want to write a translation layer on top of their already existing translation layer for arguably what they consider outdated apps, which are 32-bit apps. Microsoft has taken the opposite stance, which is Microsoft actually has versions of Windows that run on the ARM architecture, just like Apple. But Microsoft has, because they arguably have a very large legacy code base and a very large legacy industry to support, Microsoft has decided to bring along 32-bit apps as well. So 32-bit apps in the world of Microsoft are likely not going anywhere anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that QuickTime on Windows is without its issues. And the reason for that is in 2016, a security vulnerability was actually found in QuickTime for Windows. And because of that, Apple suggests uninstalling it, and it's no longer updated. Actually, what happened was Apple said, we're not going to update it anymore. And then quickly after that, a security vulnerability was found. So from a security standpoint, QuickTime on Windows is not secure, and it's not recommended by Apple or Microsoft. I don't know if it's officially recommended by Avid, but I know that it's from a security standpoint, it is not it's not a recommended thing to install. So there is sort of a push from all directions to move away from QuickTime. It's just that on the Windows side, it's far less, there's no one is forcing it in the same way that it is on the Mac side. So let's talk a little bit about Avid compatibility. So if we look at the compatibility of Media Composer with these different, the ability of these different operating systems to support these functionalities in Avid. If we look at the different macOS Mojave and earlier versus Windows and macOS Catalina and later. So if we're talking about QuickTime, the QuickTime framework is supported in macOS Mojave and earlier. It's supported on Windows, even in the newest versions of Avid, but it is not supported in macOS Catalina and later. But UME, as I mentioned, which is the replacement for QuickTime, is supported on all three. The same as, well, not the same, sorry, when it comes to Title Tool, because as I mentioned, the Avid Title Tool is also 32-bit. Title Tool is supported on macOS Mojave. It's supported on Windows in even the most recent versions of Media Composer, but it's not supported on Catalina and later. But Titler Plus, which I'll be talking about in a little while, is supported on all three. So this is sort of the point that we're at now, where Windows can do pretty much everything, but macOS is limited in that it doesn't support these older, it doesn't support the QuickTime framework or the Title Tool, which arguably the QuickTime framework we should be moving on from anyway. And Title Tool has a replacement, Titler Plus, which is a little bit of a can of worms in itself. It's very controversial, but I'll be talking about that. So there is a question from an anonymous attendee, which says, does Avid plan to update their import engine to transition away from the old QuickTime framework? This is a hard question to get answered. I've spoken to several people who either work for Avid or work very closely with Avid. And I think that Avid's approach is that they want to maintain compatibility with existing workflows. They're very hesitant to cut off any workflows that are currently existing, because arguably on the Windows side, everything is still possible. It's only on the macOS side that you run into these issues where you can't do anything anymore. So I was not able to get any sort of information about what their plan is going forward, except that they sort of want to maintain as much compatibility as possible. In my personal opinion, I obviously don't work for Avid, and my opinion is it's not going to really have any effect on their timeline going forward. But in my personal opinion, I feel that on the macOS side, especially because, as you'll see in a little while, current versions of Avid don't run on systems with Mojave and earlier. So you can't use QuickTime on current versions of Avid on a Mac. So in my personal opinion, the import button on macOS should just become link and transcode. And I'll talk about that in a little while, that it sort of is at this point, except there's a dialog box. But I feel that import on macOS should just link and transcode. And there should be an option in Avid on Windows to switch back to the QuickTime framework. That's my thought, because arguably a large portion of the people using the software can't use QuickTime functionality anyway. So why is it the default? But that's just my 2 cents. So this is the slide that you may have seen before. I use this to advertise the class. So if we look at Media Composer on modern Macs, there's wide compatibility between macOS and Media Composer through macOS Mojave 10.14, which came out in 2018. Sorry, I just have to consider this question answered. But Mojave can only run up to Media Composer 21.12, but it can do so without compromises. So it can link via QuickTime, it can use the title tool, everything. Any Mac running Catalina, Big Sur, or Monterey can only run Media Composer 2020.4 or later, and can't use the Avid Title Tool or functionality based on the legacy QuickTime framework. So that includes linking, importing, or exporting functions based on QuickTime. So what are your options here? And when I've spoken to people, one of the first things they say is, all right, fine. So I want to have, I want to keep QuickTime and I want to keep the title tool. So I'll just roll back my computer. I'll just install Mojave on my Mac. Okay, so let's talk about rolling back. So the earliest OS a Mac can run, and this is a rule. This is you can remember this as a law. The earliest OS a Mac can run is the one that it shipped with when first released. So if we look at the current Apple lineup, the Mac Pro came out in 2019, and it first shipped with macOS Catalina, which means that the earliest version of the operating system that you could roll it back to is macOS Catalina. The Mac Mini came out in 2010. First version was Big Sur. The current iMac came out in 21. First version was also Big Sur. The MacBook Pro 14 and 16 inch came out last year. They shipped with macOS Monterey. The Mac Studio shipped with macOS Monterey. The MacBook Pro 13 inch, which was just announced recently, which has an M2 chip, shipped with macOS Monterey, and the MacBook Air, which just started shipping on Friday, I think, 2 days ago, came with macOS Monterey, or comes with macOS Monterey as well. But there's one that Apple doesn't talk about. If you go to Apple's website and you go to the page where you can buy a Mac Mini, bizarrely enough, they have the M1 Mac Mini, but if you scroll further down the page, they actually still sell an Intel Mac Mini that came out in 2018. And it can run macOS Mojave. So if you absolutely need a new Mac that can run macOS Mojave, you can buy one. I wouldn't, but you can. It will ship with Monterey, but you can actually roll it back or dual boot into macOS Mojave. And it's not just this Mac Mini that can be rolled back to Mojave. Any system that came out before the fall of 2019 can be rolled back or dual booted into macOS Mojave. I actually, in prepping this class, borrowed my dad's 2013 MacBook Pro, which is running Monterey, and I installed Mojave on an external drive and dual booted his system just so that I could do some testing on Media Composer 2018-12. So if you have a system that you're running Mojave on, that you're running Monterey on, and for some reason you need to go back and do something in 2018-12, you're not screwed. You can actually buy an external drive and you can install Mojave on it, and you can dual boot. And basically anything from 2019 and earlier can do that. And all of this information came from a website called everymac.com. So in general, if you're looking for information about Apple products, when they were released, their capabilities, anything like that, there are two great resources for that. One is everymac.com, which is exhaustive. They have everything you could ever want in terms of information about Macs. The other one, which I use because it's it's less overwhelming, and it's actually an app on your phone or your Mac, is called Mac Tracker. And you can download either of those and it'll give you all kinds of information about Apple products. It'll tell you what OS they originally shipped with. It'll tell you the maximum RAM that they can have. It'll tell you all kinds of really useful information. Okay, so that's the resource that I would use when trying to figure this information out. So I mentioned that you can roll back or dual boot to Mojave. So would I recommend doing that? If you absolutely need to, then yes. But I would not recommend staying on Mojave if you have another option. And the reason for that is that macOS Mojave is, at this point, it's 4 years old, which in absolute terms isn't that old, but in the world of Apple operating systems is pretty old. The two most recent versions of Media Composer, which is versions 2022.4 and 22.7, are not qualified for Mojave. So any version of Media Composer going forward will not run in macOS Mojave. I don't know if they'll run, actually. They're not qualified for it, which means that Avid doesn't test them. So that's a good reason to look into a newer operating system. Apple no longer provides security updates for Mojave. So if there is some kind of bug, well, not bug, if there's some kind of security threat going around, Apple will not provide any kind of security updates to fix the operating system. Their rule is they only provide security updates for, I believe it's the 2 previous operating systems. So at this point, Catalina and Big Sur would be the ones that it's providing security updates for. It's now 4 years old, and other apps are either starting to or have already dropped support for it. And lastly, actually not lastly, newer, much faster, and when I say much faster, I'll talk about it later, but newer Macs are much faster than they were even like 4 years ago. Newer, much faster Macs will not run Mojave. And as a Mac user, the move is kind of inevitable. At some point, you're going to have to move on to not having QuickTime, and you're going to move on to not having Title Tool. So if you have downtime at some point and you feel like you could make the switch, I would strongly recommend doing it, because if you decide not to do it, again, you're sort of putting off the inevitable. So what about sort of arguably the elephant in the room, which is running Windows? Not running Windows on a Windows computer, but running Windows on your Mac. So Media Composer can actually run on Windows through Boot Camp on any Intel Mac. And that might be useful because if you have an Intel Mac that shipped with Catalina or later, you can't run Mojave, but you can actually run Avid with QuickTime on Windows. So that includes the 2019 Mac Pro, the 27-inch iMac that came out in 2020, the 2020 MacBook Air, and the 13 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, which were both Intel, that came out in 2019 and 2020. All of these systems, if you absolutely need to run the older version of Avid and you have a little bit of tech savvy, you can boot up into Windows, you can install Media Composer, even the newest version, and you can run it with QuickTime and the Title Tool. Again, as a Mac user, if you're doing this, you bought a Mac for a reason. If you're going to be running Windows on it, that's fine. But at some point, you're going to need a new computer, and Apple Silicon Macs, which includes the M1 and now the M2, can only run Windows through a virtual machine like Parallels, and Media Composer cannot run through a virtual machine. So because of that, there's no way to run Avid with QuickTime on Apple Silicon. So I, for example, have a MacBook Pro 14-inch, which has an M1 Max, and this system can't run can't run Media Composer within Windows. I have Windows 11 installed on it through Parallels, but if I try to start up Media Composer, it will not run. So on this system, I have no other option than to sort of embrace the future, which is to say, figure out how to work without QuickTime and without Title Tool, which I've had no problem with, but mostly because I understand the situation and I've been able to navigate it in such a way that I don't get frustrated by things because I know why they're happening. And going back to why I decided to do this class, if I didn't understand why all this was happening and suddenly stuff didn't work anymore, that would be pretty frustrating. That's why I'm doing the class. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Media Composer compatibility. So when it comes to when it comes to Media Composer, Avid qualifies versions of Media Composer to work with specific versions of macOS. The same is true with Windows. So when we talk about versions of macOS, basically as a rule, the newest OS usually requires the newest version of Avid. So if you purchase a brand new Mac that is running the newest OS, and your license for Media Composer is only goes up to, let's say, a version that's 2 years old, you might have kind of a problem because you will likely either not be able to run the newest version, or sorry, you will not likely either not be able to run Media Composer on that computer, or you will be running in an unsupported configuration. Which, what does that mean? Well, actually, I'll come back to that in just a minute. So new versions of macOS are released in the fall, and that's been every year since that's wrong. That's actually since 2011, as I showed you guys earlier. And they usually take 3 to 4 months for Avid to qualify. So what does qualify mean? Well, qualify in Avid's terms basically means that they go through the functionalities of Media Composer and they confirm that everything works properly and that there are no issues. After a while, Avid no longer qualifies operating systems. So for example, I mentioned that the newest versions of Media Composer aren't qualified with Mojave. I haven't tested trying to run those versions of Media Composer on Mojave, but the fact that Avid doesn't qualify them anymore means that there could be parts of the program that don't work anymore, which would be a problem. Avid also has to qualify point releases, which can be also kind of frustrating because you might buy a new Mac, for example, like a couple weeks ago, and it's running macOS 12.4 Monterey, but the newest version of Media Composer is only qualified for up to 12.3, which is kind of a frustrating situation. It doesn't mean that you can't install Media Composer on your system. It just means that Avid hasn't tested that version of Media Composer with that version of the OS, so there may be problems. So if a macOS and Media Composer combo is not qualified, as I said before, it doesn't necessarily mean it won't work, but it means that it's not recommended. So Avid either has not qualified it yet, or doesn't plan on qualifying it if it's an older operating system. All right, so another thing that's really important to know is that as a rule, an OS, an operating system, can only run versions of Media Composer that have come out since its release. So if we look at versions of macOS, Mojave came out in 2018. The earliest version of Media Composer that could run it was Media Composer 2018.10. Catalina came out in 2019. This was a little bit of a different situation because it took longer to qualify because of the dropping of QuickTime. The earliest version of Media Composer that could run it was 2020.4. Big Sur came out in 2020. Earliest version of Media Composer to run it was 2020.12. And Monterey came out in 21. The earliest version of Media Composer to run it was 2021.12. That's a mouthful. And so you can also see from this, I didn't give dates of when they came out, but all of these come out in the fall, usually October or September. And you can see by the dates that the versions of Media Composer that were compatible usually come out pretty quickly. Because if these operating systems are coming out in September, October, and we're looking at 0.12 releases, that means that the version of Media Composer came out in December, which means it's like 3 months. So that's not bad. So they usually come out fairly quickly. But also note that Apple Silicon was only supported beginning in Media Composer 2021.12 and later. And that's actually through what I talked about before, which is a translation layer called Rosetta. So even though you can run Media Composer currently on any Mac with an Apple Silicon chip, it's technically still running through a translation layer. And Avid has said that they will be coming out with a version of Media Composer that will be what you call native, which basically means it doesn't use Rosetta anymore, but that has not happened yet. Okay, so lastly, all of this information that I've given in these past 2 slides, I have to thank Chris Beauvais. I hope that's how I pronounce your last name, Chris. I don't know that I've ever said it before. But Chris is an awesome guy and has a website where he keeps track of all the versions of Media Composer. He just recently redid the website. It's fantastic. And you can go to it. It's alwaysediting.com/avidmcversions. And you can find out all of this information about what versions of Media Composer are compatible with what versions of both macOS and Windows. So I would highly recommend going to that website. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the impact on Media Composer. So I mentioned before that that these newer or that Catalina and later drop support for 32-bit apps. And I mentioned that Media Composer still use 32-bit code for QuickTime in macOS and Windows for importing, exporting, and linking to MOV and MP4, linking to MXF, basically anything other than MOV and MP4 has been unaffected by this transition. So if you're talking about linking to camera media that's MXFs, no effect. If you're talking about linking to GoPro footage, iPhone footage, anything that is in an MOV or MP4 container, all of that stuff has been affected by this transition. The other thing that was dropped is Title Tool. So let's talk a little bit more about linking and importing. So how does linking and importing work in Avid? So if we look at linking and importing in Media Composer, they're both ways to bring in footage. And you would do both through, I mean, there's a couple ways that you can bring it in, but through the source browser usually. So the first way to do that is through importing. The second one is to link and then consolidate or transcode your footage. So in most NLEs, Premiere, Resolve, Final Cut, the concept of importing is actually merely creating a reference to the file, and it doesn't create new media. So if you go into Premiere and you drop a file into Adobe Premiere, that's called importing the file, but Premiere doesn't actually create any new media when you import that file. In Media Composer, importing actually creates new media in an Avid Media Files folder. So the concept of importing in Avid is a little bit different. I believe, somebody could correct me, but I believe that's because Media Composer has a longer history, and the way that the Media Composer likes to deal with media is by organizing it into Avid Media Files folders itself. And so originally the only way to get media into Avid was to import it, which would create new media in an Avid Media Files folder. But linking in Avid is actually similar to importing in other NLEs. So when you link to something in Media Composer, instead of creating new media in a Media Files folder, what it's doing is it's actually just creating a reference to a file in the file system. So linking in Media Composer is similar to importing in other NLEs. But the difference in Avid, at least from the official standpoint, is that linked clips in Media Composer are really not meant to be used for editing. They're really meant to bring something in so that you can then transcode or consolidate it. So I mentioned transcoding and consolidating. Once linked, media in Avid can either be transcoded or consolidated. Consolidating is the process of copying that media to an Avid Media Files folder, but it doesn't change the codec. So if you link to a ProRes file and then consolidate it, basically what you're doing is you're taking that ProRes MOV that's sitting, let's say, on a drive that you have connected to Avid, or sorry, to your computer, and you are copying the essence of that ProRes file into an MXF in an Avid Media Files folder, but still as a ProRes. So consolidating is basically taking something that is somewhere in the file system and moving it into an Avid Media Files folder without changing the codec at all. It won't change the file size. It won't change anything about it except for the location and the container. It'll take, whatever container it's in and move it into a Media Files folder. So an MXF. Transcoding, on the other hand, actually changes the codec and places that media into an Avid Media Files folder. So if you take, let's say, iPhone footage, you cannot consolidate iPhone footage because only Avid native codecs can be consolidated. So anything in general, anything that, if you go into your media creation settings in Avid, anything that you can transcode to in Avid is considered an Avid native codec. That's actually not really true. There are several codecs in there that you can't consolidate, but only Avid native codecs can be consolidated. So if you link to something like iPhone footage, then in order to bring it into Avid, you would actually have to transcode it into a format like Dnxhd, Dnxhr, or ProRes. So transcoding actually changes the codec and then places the file into an Avid Media Files folder. So if you look at it from the big picture, importing is taking a file and putting it into an Avid Media Files folder. With a fast import, it's similar to consolidating, where it just takes that file, doesn't change the codec, drops it into an Avid Media Files folder. And then with a normal import, you specify the codec that you want to import as, it imports it, drops it into an Avid Media Files folder. So if you think about it, linking and consolidating or transcoding is effectively the same as importing, except linking requires an extra step, because before you can actually get something into an Avid Media Files folder, you actually have to put it into a bin and then choose consolidate transcode. But really that's the only disadvantage, because linking and consolidating also allows you to ingest just a portion of a file. So let's say you have a 2-hour movie and you want a clip from it that's 2 minutes long. If you import that 2-hour movie, you're going to have to wait forever because the import engine is really slow. But you also you have no choice. You either have to create a clip outside of Avid and then bring in that 2-minute clip as part of your import, or you have to import the entire 2-hour movie and then just use the portion that you need. If you link to that file, you can actually choose, set an in point and an out point, create a subclip, and then only transcode that subclip, that 2-minute subclip, for example, much faster. So it allows you to ingest portions of a file. It allows for quick access to files for reference. So I've done this many times. If you did an output and you want to double check that everything looks correct on the output you did, or maybe you have a file that you need to reference for some other reason, if you try to import it, it has to create a brand new file before you can even look at it in Avid. But if you link to that file, then all you have to do is drop it into a bin, open it up, and play it back in a timeline. In addition to that, linking and transcoding, or the linking engine, I should say, has support for many more and much more modern codecs than importing. Number one, it's just much faster. The import engine is ancient. It takes forever. It's based on QuickTime, and it's very slow. And actually, that brings me into my next point, which I've already kind of said, which is that the import engine is largely based on legacy QuickTime, and it hasn't been updated since the early 2000s. So there may have been a change here or there, but the back end for the import engine is probably about 25 years old, which means that it's based on the technology and the computers that we were using 20 to 25 years ago. Linking was introduced by Avid around 2007 using AMA, which is also based on legacy QuickTime. So the process of linking, when you're using an MOV or an MP4, traditionally in Media Composer, that linking was done through QuickTime, through the AMA plugin for QuickTime. With the introduction of Media Composer 2020.4, that reliance on AMA and QuickTime was actually replaced with UME. So UME was introduced, Universal Media Engine, was introduced as a replacement for AMA, and it allows for linking to MOV and MP4 files without needing QuickTime. So if you're using a newer version of Avid, the only way to bring in MOV and MP4 files is by linking and transcoding or consolidating through UME. But the import engine is still there. It's still completely intact. It remains untouched, and it still uses QuickTime for importing video. As I said before, linking and transcoding is because of their relative ages. Linking and transcoding is much faster than importing. In addition to that, modern codecs like H.265 are only supported through UME. There is no support through import. So if you try to import an H.265 file in Avid, it will not work because the import engine is old, has not been updated. I don't believe Avid plans to update it because, as I said before, QuickTime is also considered end of life, but it's still there. In addition to that, audio MP3s, for example, I believe Avid used QuickTime, the QuickTime plugin to link to MP3s. And because of that, MP3 audio can't be imported. It must be linked and transcoded, but most other audio and graphics can still be imported because they don't use the QuickTime framework. So this is a lot of information. I've thrown a lot of stuff at you guys. I'm about to move on to a new section, which specifically covers working in Avid in modern macOS. But before I move on, does anybody have any questions? I'm going to give it like 30 seconds. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and throw up your question and I will try to answer it. Okay, I'm going to assume, since I haven't seen anything, that there are no questions, and I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay. Oh, I guess we got some questions. Okay, so if Windows systems use, if a Windows system is using Media Composer 2018 that links to a file and transcodes it, is it using legacy QuickTime or UME? So Media Composer 2018 does not have UME. I don't think it has any UME functionality. Actually, there might be. So UME was actually deployed before Media Composer 2020.4 for things like linking to EXRs. So there is some functionality in Media Composer 2018 that uses UME, but not the important functionality, which is linking to MOVs and MP4s. So if you're on Media Composer 2018, Mac or Windows, and you link to an MP4 or an MOV, it is using QuickTime to do that. I hope that answers the question. It was asked, will this all be online later? Yeah. So as I said before, we'll be putting this video up on our website, and I'll also be distributing the slideshow. So anyone who wants a copy of the slideshow, just send me an email and I will send it to you personally. Question is, how does MP3 use QuickTime? MP3 is actually based on MPEG 2 layer 3, I believe. And in those early days, I think a lot of the MPEG formats were already pretty well covered by QuickTime. So I suspect that when implementing support for MP3, Avid decided the best thing to do would just be to handle it through QuickTime. So yeah, bizarrely enough, MP3 is actually based on part of a video codec. But yeah, that's the reason that, at least that's my understanding of why MP3 uses QuickTime. So the question is, do I think that the transition from AMA to AMA linking to UME is what most scares people moving over to new versions of Media Composer? Honestly, if I were looking at the situation, the thing that would scare me the most is that stuff doesn't work. Like importing doesn't work. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But like basic functionality of Avid on a modern Mac seemingly does not work. That would be very confusing to me as a new user, and would definitely make me want to avoid switching. As far as the transition from AMA linking to UME, yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of baggage, and it's not well documented. The documentation that is out there I've found does not get regularly. This is, again, I'm not throwing shade on Avid, but the documentation that is out there is not that regularly updated. And I don't think that there's been enough PR about how to handle this transition. I feel like in a lot of ways, you're sort of left to your own devices. It's like move to the new version and then realize that half your workflow doesn't work anymore. So I don't know if that really answered the question, but I'll be getting into more of how you handle it and the changes that take place next. Okay, it looks like I've answered all the questions, so let's go ahead and move on. All right, so let's talk about working in Media Composer on macOS. So if you were running macOS Catalina and later, number one, I would recommend always, if possible, always being on the newest version of Media Composer, because the way that this situation has played out, with almost every version of Media Composer, things get better. Media Composer 2020.4, when I used it early on, was very difficult because a lot of things just didn't work. There are still things that don't work, but there are a lot of workarounds in the newer versions of Media Composer that make life a lot easier, and I'll be talking about those. But let's go ahead and talk about bringing in media in Media Composer. All right, so if you're on Media Composer on a Mac running Catalina or later, any attempts to import video, whether dropping that media into a MOV or MP4 files, dropping that media into a bin, or using the import window, which I don't know why it's still there. Why is the import media button still there if we have the source browser? I don't know, especially because if you try to import media other than audio, like WAV files or graphics, this is what happens. So you hit open and it does nothing, literally nothing. And the reason for that is that it can't import that file because it doesn't have QuickTime. So for some reason, this import media button still exists. Even on macOS, they could hide it, which seems like it would make sense to me, because it doesn't work. And that's especially relevant because the same is not true with the source browser. The source browser, Avid has actually done a very good job with helping this situation on the source browser side. So in the source browser, any attempt to import video will fail, but it will actually offer to link and consolidate it instead. So if you go into, if you try to import a file from the source browser, when you click import, it will actually come up with this nice little dialog that says it can't be imported, but do you want to link and consolidate instead? And if you say yes, you actually avoid that two-step process of linking and then having to go into the consolidate transcode menu. And it's actually kind of convenient. Even though it's kind of a workaround, I might actually this might actually be the way that I would bring in media, because it's linking and transcoding, but it's one step instead of two. So that's very useful. But there's one big asterisk with this whole thing, which is that when you do this, you have the import box checked, but you're not actually importing anything. What you're doing is you're linking and transcoding. So this can be really confusing because you might be bringing in a graphic with an alpha channel, and the alpha channel might come in wrong. And you're like, okay, well, I'm importing the file because I have the import box checked. So I'm just going to go ahead and go into my import settings, and I'm going to switch my alpha channel setting on my import. And then you go back and you import the file again, and it's still wrong. The reason that's happening is because you're not importing that file. You're actually linking and transcoding that file. So what you need to do is you actually need to go into your link settings, which are completely separate, and change your alpha channel setting there. If this isn't confusing, then I don't know what is. So again, no shade on Avid. I just think that the way that this works out is very hard to understand. So as I say on the left here, link settings, like your alpha channel setting, are actually separate from your import settings. So if you go in and you try to import something and you can't, but you decide to link and consolidate or transcode instead, you actually need to go in and change your link settings, not your import settings, because you're not linking. So let's talk a little bit more about alpha channels. So alpha channels are still supported without QuickTime in ProRes Quad 4, Dnxhd 444, animation, although you'll have to transcode because you can't consolidate animation, and PNG sequences. And PNG sequences can actually be imported. They don't have to be linked and transcoded because they're not video. But you might notice that Dnxhd is missing from this list. So Dnxhd is kind of in an interesting situation because, as I understand it, when Avid decided, well, arguably when Avid was forced to move away from QuickTime, they had to change the way that they had to change the header, which is basically just information about what's in a file. They had to change the header on Dnxhd files to be compatible with without QuickTime. And so they came up with a new header. I think they came up with it. I would assume they did because it's their format. They came up with a new header, which is used by UME, which is called an ADHR v2 header. And I only know that because they mention it in some of their documentation. And the ADHR v2 header is backwards compatible if you have the right codecs, but it deals with the alpha channel differently. And because of that, if you're on a newer version of Media Composer and you don't have QuickTime and you try to import a Dnxhd file with an alpha channel, it will actually have to rewrap it first. And there's documentation on this that you can find. But if you drop in that file, Avid will say it has to rewrap it to an MXF, and it'll ask you where you want to store that file. The reason for that is that UME, which is the engine that is bringing in the file, can't read the alpha data, and so it's using a separate process to basically rewrite that file with a new header that it can where it can read the alpha channel data. So it's doing a conversion basically. And another thing to note, I actually tested this yesterday, is in earlier versions of Media Composer, you could actually import other files that arguably didn't have an alpha channel, like DNX36 with an alpha channel that you could render out of like After Effects. And as far as I can tell, other Dnxhd media with an alpha channel is no longer supported. So if you try to bring DNX36 in with an alpha, it will not work. Okay, so okay, so that's alpha channels. Let's talk a little bit more about something else that we lost in the transition, which is batch reimport. So someone pointed out they believe Targa with alpha still works. I will take your word for it. I have not tested it, but that would make sense because Targa is an image, and as far as I understand it, image sequences have never used the QuickTime engine. They use something else behind the scenes, and so they don't there doesn't have to be any change behind. There's no need to move away from QuickTime there. Okay, so batch reimport still uses the QuickTime import engine, and because of that, it does not work for video. So if you link and consolidate or link and transcode to a ProRes, and then you try to, let's say you're working with motion graphics, and your normal workflow is to bring in the first version of a, let's say a lower third, and then when you get a new version, you delete the media and then you batch reimport. Not going to happen. If you try to do that on current versions of Media Composer on current macOS, number one, you can't import the lower third to begin with. If it's a video, you'd have to link and consolidate or transcode. And then if you delete the media and then you try to batch reimport, it does exactly the same thing as if you try to import, which is that you can specify the location, you can specify the file, you can tell it all the information, and then when you hit the import button, it does nothing. So kind of a frustrating situation, but there are a couple ways around this. Number one is if you're dealing with if you're dealing with just regular media, let's say you have footage that you brought in, and for some reason it doesn't have an alpha channel, and you just want to replace it. Instead of using batch reimport, and this is a general rule, even if you're on, let's say, Windows where you have this functionality, relinking is always faster. Relinking and then consolidating or transcoding, because you don't have to use the import engine, which is slower everywhere. So if you want to replace something that doesn't have an alpha channel, just relink. But there's no way to relink video with an alpha channel. So if you have a motion graphic that has an alpha channel, your only option, and this is one that I didn't even know about until I posted about it and someone told me, is you can actually use a PNG sequence. So if you render out, and you have to do this from the beginning, as far as I can tell, if you render out a PNG sequence, you can then import that PNG sequence, and then if you get a new version, you can just batch import a new PNG sequence. But if you start with, let's say, a ProRes, and then you decide that you want to switch over to a PNG sequence so that you can do the batch import, I tested this and the alpha channel didn't work correctly. If anyone has had other experiences, please let me know. But as far as I could tell, if you wanted to use a batch import workflow, you have to use PNG sequences. Someone asked, what's an alpha channel? So if you don't know what an alpha channel is, hopefully you don't have to know. But it basically means if you're dealing with graphics of some kind, and you need something to be visible behind the graphic that you're importing. So for example, with a lower third, you don't want the background to be black because you need to see whatever is behind the graphic. And so you import it with what's called an alpha channel, and then it becomes a keyed graphic. And you'll notice that because it has a different icon. And if you drill down, it actually has two layers. And one of the layers is black and white, and it uses the black space and the white space to specify what's alpha. Anyway, if you don't know that already, then hopefully you don't have to know it. So anyway, as I mentioned before, I'm trying to cater to everybody here. So I'm throwing in a lot of information that might not be relevant for some of you. That's fine. You can either tune me out or just keep it in mind for the future. But those of you who are working, I'm a VFX editor. I deal with alpha channels all the time. This is very useful information. So I'm just trying to make sure that everybody has all of the information that they could possibly need. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the differences between UME and QuickTime. So UME actually reads and writes media differently from QuickTime. And you'll see that because files linked via UME may actually have a different duration from the same file linked via QuickTime. So for example, if you look at this bin, you'll see this is a bunch of GoPro footage. If you look right here, you'll notice that we have the same clip. One is linked via UME and one is linked via QuickTime. The UME link is 1 frame longer than the QuickTime link. Kind of frustrating because that means that media that's imported or linked and transcoded with the QuickTime plugin may not relink via UME if the durations don't match. So if you're working, let's say you're working on a UME system, and your online is going to be done on a system that doesn't have UME. First of all, I would not recommend that. But even the other way around, let's say that you're working on a system that has QuickTime and your online is going to be done, and your online editor is going to be linking to the clips. If you do all your transcodes on using QuickTime linked media, then your online editor, if they're working on a newer Mac that doesn't have QuickTime, may not be able to relink some of those clips because the durations might be, the durations might vary, which is kind of a frustrating situation. So, and I'm actually going to come back to that though. So if you're dealing with UME or QuickTime, it's important to know that you can actually tell whether you've linked to a file via UME or QuickTime, because in both the bin and the source browser, there is a column for plugin that will tell you how a file either was linked before it was transcoded or is linked currently. And you'll see that over here in the source browser on the right, you can see it says UME link on all of those clips. And if you right click, you can actually choose how to link to that file. So let's say you're on a system, because as I've said before, systems with QuickTime installed, which includes pre-Catalina macOS or Windows, you can still use the AMA QuickTime plugin for linking media. So on Windows, for example, files will link by default with UME, but you can actually right-click and choose to switch over to using QuickTime. The same is not true on macOS, because new versions of macOS, because QuickTime's not there. But it's important to know that you can tell in a bin how something was linked when it was transcoded, because the plugin column will list how that file was linked before it was transcoded. So if you're on a new Mac and you have to do an upres and you get a bin with a bunch of clips, you can check beforehand if QuickTime was used to transcode those files by pulling up the plugin column, which is very useful. Okay, so let's talk about compatibility, because as with everything, not everybody moves on or switches at the same time. So you're going to be dealing with some compatibility between the new versions of Avid on macOS and either people who are working on Windows or who are working on older versions of macOS. So let's talk about compatibility within linking. So files linked via QuickTime can't be read by Media Composer on the new version of macOS, flat out. If you try to open up a bin on the new version of macOS that has QuickTime links, they will show up in the bin. They will say that they're linked, but they will say media offline. And unfortunately, the links that were created via QuickTime also can't be upgraded to UME. You actually have to create new links to the files. So if you have, let's say you get 20 bins that were all linked via QuickTime, and you're on a new Mac and you don't have QuickTime, in order to do that upres, you will have to go through all 20 bins and relink to all of those files. That's the only way to do it. If they had tape name, I'm sorry, that sucks. This whole situation can be very difficult. And then next, MOV and MP4 files linked via UME can't be read by older versions of Avid. So if you're on a new Mac and you link to a bunch of files, and let's say you do you work with them, but you don't consolidate or transcode, and then you take that bin and you take the files and you hand them off to someone on Media Composer 2018.12, they will open the bin and everything will be offline. Even if, let's say that all the files were sitting in the same locations on an external drive with the same name, it'll still all be offline. They will have to bring in new links based on QuickTime, and they will have to relink that sequence because Media Composer 2018.12 cannot read UME links. But the silver lining in all of this is that this is only if you're dealing with linked media. As soon as you consolidate or transcode that media, everything will be fine. So if you're dealing with, if you're moving back and forth between versions of Avid and you have linked media, it's going to be a huge headache. I would highly recommend that before you go to any other version of Avid, you consolidate or transcode that media. All right, so I didn't have these slides initially, but I decided to add recap slides because I've just thrown a bunch of crap at you, and I want to make sure that I get across the stuff that's really important. So I've added little recap slides. So to recap, when bringing in media, number one, you can't import video in Avid on macOS Catalina and later. Number two, you can link and consolidate instead, which is much faster anyway. And as I mentioned before, if you're using the source browser, it will offer to link and consolidate if you try to import. But if you're not using the source browser, and let's say you just drop something into a bin, nothing will happen. Batch import does not work for video, so I would recommend relinking instead. Use PNG sequences to batch import motion graphics, and linked files are not backwards compatible. So as I said before, if you're working with a system that doesn't have UME, and you have a bunch of link clips that are linked via UME, because that's the only way to link MP4s and MOVs on newer versions of macOS. So there's a question that says on the first recap bullet, can't import video. Do you mean only video regarding using QuickTime? So I may be wrong, but I can't think of any video that you would import that's not in an MOV or MP4 container, because I don't think you've ever been able to import OP1A MXFs. And I can't think of anything else video-wise that you can import that's not an MOV or an MP4. So that's why I said you can't import video in Avid on macOS Catalina and later. I could be wrong, and if I am, let me know. But that's why I said that. So you can still import stills. You can still import image sequences. You can still import certain types of audio. You can still import basically anything that didn't use the QuickTime engine. Okay, all right. So let's talk about exporting. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay. All right. Go back to this. Okay. So let's talk about exporting media. So exporting media in Avid has generally been through a setting in this drop-down menu called QuickTime Movie. QuickTime Movie is no longer available because QuickTime Movie was the QuickTime framework. So in macOS Catalina and later, the only way to export an MOV or an MP4 is through the MOV or MP4 dropdown in the export dialog, which honestly is a little bit more logical because all of the other ones are formats. So it makes sense that MOV and MP4 would have their own as well. And in my opinion, this is the export situation, I feel, is in the best shape of this situation, because the export functionality, for the most part, it is in every way just as good as it was with QuickTime, except for a couple things that I'll mention. But it's much faster. So you can now export things in probably twice the time that you could before using UME instead of QuickTime. And you have, for the most part, all of the settings that you had within your QuickTime export window. And you can see here through this dropdown, you have options for AVC Intra, AVC Long GOP, Apple ProRes, Dnxhd, Dnxhr, H.264, H.265, and Motion JPEG. So a lot of different options for exporting with this MOV dialog. One thing to note that's a little bit unfortunate, but life moves on. You can no longer export same as source, and you can no longer export a QuickTime reference. So you can effectively create a same as source file by choosing to export something that's already one single codec and then exporting it at that codec. So for example, if you have a timeline, you know everything in the timeline is DNX36. You go to your export dialog and you choose DNX36. Arguably, that's a same as source export. On the back end, I'm not sure how Avid deals with it. I don't know if the application is smart enough to bypass re-encoding that DNX36 because it sees that everything is already in the right codec. I would hope that it does, and in which case that would be the same thing as doing a same as source. But QuickTime reference is gone altogether. All right. So another thing to note is that if you export your settings from an older version of Avid and you have export settings within those settings. So let's say you have an export setting for some kind of delivery H.264 and then something for DNX36 or something like that. If you're coming from Media Composer 2018 or earlier, or actually Media Composer 2019 or earlier, all of those export settings are based on QuickTime exports. Because of that, when you bring your settings over to the new version of Avid on the new version of macOS, all of your settings will actually show up as AAFs because it doesn't know how to read them. They are QuickTime settings. And you will have to go through and recreate those settings using your UME or using the UME dialog. So I would strongly recommend that if you're taking your settings from an old version of Avid and you need to bring your export settings with you, that you take screenshots of what each setting was so that you can recreate it with UME. Because as I said before, when you bring it over, all of your export settings will be there. But if you hit options and you bring up the window for, to configure it, it'll say it's an AAF. So that's kind of a disappointment. All right, so another thing to note, as I mentioned before, is that Dnxhd files written by UME use a new header, which is the ADHR v2 header. And because of that, they require either a patch or new Avid codecs, the new Avid codecs LE pack, to be read by older versions of Avid or third-party apps. So to give you an example of this, I was working on a shot in After Effects on Friday, And I was using the newest version of After Effects, which uses the newest version of Dnxhd, which writes headers as ADHRv2. I exported a DNX36 from After Effects. I tried to bring it into Media Composer 2018.12 and it showed up as black. And the reason for that is that Media Composer 2018.12 cannot read DNX36 files with the ADHRv2 header. So what you have to do is you have to actually go download the newest version of the Avid Codex LE pack, install that on your computer. It's actually a QuickTime codec, but you're running Media Composer 2018.12, so you're still using QuickTime. And once you install those codecs, it can now read that DNX36 or that whatever DNX with the new header. And I think there's been a lot of confusion about this in the Adobe world as well, because with Dnxhd, Adobe has now switched to these new headers as well, which has made older versions of software incompatible. So if you're dealing with or if you're working with Dnxhd, make sure that whatever software you're using to read the Dnxhd, you're on the newest patch update to that software, because it is likely written with this new header. Another thing that you'll notice is that the name has changed. Normally in Media Composer, older versions of Media Composer, Dnxhd always used numbers. So you talk about DNX36, DNX115, DNX220. Well, Dnxhd versions in the new version of Media Composer have actually been, Dnxhd resolutions have actually been renamed with labels instead of bitrate. And this, my understanding is that this actually has to do with the change of header. When they switched over to using the new header, they decided to change the labels. So whenever something is written as Dnxhd Dnxhd LB, for example, that means that it was written with the newer header. So the versions are DNX LB, which is now effectively the same thing as DNX36 and DNX45. Dnxhd SQ, which is the same thing as DNX115 and DNX145. Dnxhd HQ, which is the same thing as DNX175 and DNX220. And Dnxhd HQX, which is the same thing as 175X and 220X. So if you get a spec sheet that says somebody wants a file as a DNX36 and you are working in the new version of Avid, good luck finding a reference to DNX36, because it is not there. DNX36 in newer versions of Media Composer is now referred to as Dnxhd LB. And the same is true with all of these. If you see any of these references to any of the numbers, or if you're trying to create any of these numbered versions, what you need to understand is that instead of referring to them by the numbers, they're now referred to with these names. And keep in mind that even though the terminology is the same, the Dnxhd format is still different from DNxHR. Dnxhd is still limited to HD. So it has, they're now referring to it by these names, but Dnxhd can still only be 1280 by 720 or 1920 by 1080. If you want something that's larger than either of those, or something bizarre, like some weird random frame size, you have to use DnxHR. Okay, so to recap exporting media, use the export preset for MOV and MP4 instead of QuickTime Movie. There's no ability to create a QuickTime reference or a same as source file. All of your export settings coming over from a previous version of Media Composer that had QuickTime will need to be recreated. But the silver lining is that exports are now much faster. And honestly, with a lot of this stuff, it's all good news. The bad news is that we have to deal with all of the switching over. So if you're starting from the ground up, everything is better. It's just that it's a lot of change, and it's a lot of change that's happened quickly. So for example, exports, transcodes, imports, they're all much faster, which is actually brings me into my next slide, which is the advantages of UME. So UME overall, hands down, way better than QuickTime. UME has much faster transcodes and exports. I did a test yesterday to be able to give you a number, and importing and exporting, it was more than twice the speed of, oh, sorry, not importing and exporting, because you can't import, but bringing footage in and exporting footage using UME instead of QuickTime. The UME export and UME export and link and transcode were twice the speed of importing or exporting with QuickTime, so much faster. Another thing that's really great about UME is that it now has proper support for linking to files with variable frame rate. So you might say, why would I ever need that? Well, a lot of phones, the iPhone, for example, will actually lower their frame rate to bring in more light in low light situations. So if you bring in iPhone footage, in older versions of Avid, if you brought that footage in, it would retime it, because it was actually variable frame rate footage. It would actually retime it so that if you tried to line it up with a camera that had a consistent frame rate, it wouldn't match. And I haven't tested this, so I can't say this for sure, but this is my understanding of how it works. But I believe now what it will do is, instead of basically taking the frames that are there and just playing them out at, let's say, 24 frames per second, it will actually keep the cadence of the footage, so that if you then take that footage and link and try to match it to another camera that has a constant frame rate, it will work properly. Support for exporting MP4 files. So with the I believe, I didn't get confirmation on this, but I'd never seen anyone been able to export an MP4 out of the QuickTime dialog. But there is now a dedicated MP4 export function in Media Composer. And with the QuickTime export, I believe you had to export an MOV and then like change the file extension, because they're basically the same thing. So that's kind of nice. Support for linking and exporting H.265, which is also called HEVC. Super useful if you are on Media Composer 2018.12 and you've brought in iPhone footage and Avid can't read it. That's because it's H.265. Newer versions of Media Composer can link and transcode that footage. Still can't import, but that's extremely useful. There's also support for QuickTime files that are asymmetrical. So basically, if you have a file where the audio lasts longer than the video track, or if you have a file where the reverse is true, the video track goes on longer than the audio, in previous versions of Media Composer, it couldn't read that file because it didn't have any way to do that. With UME, you can now read those files and it reads them properly. Again, I haven't tested this. I'm going off the release notes, but that could potentially be fairly useful. Also support for HDR color metadata. So if you're trying to create an HDR file, you can actually specify under your color space that something should be, let's say, tagged as Rec 2020 or P3, so that whatever program opens it will actually read the color space correctly, which is super useful. You could, I mean, I don't think you could do that in Avid, or sorry, within the QuickTime export function. And if you could, I don't think it worked very well. So it's really nice that that function is now there. And then the last thing is that we now have in Media Composer on macOS and Windows support through UME for ProRes RAW, which is fantastic. So if something's shot ProRes RAW, you can link and transcode using Avid. Great. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the QuickTime situation, but I haven't really touched on the whole title tool thing. Sorry, I'm gonna take a quick drink of water. If anyone has any questions while I'm drinking water, please go ahead and post those and I will try to answer them. Okay. All right, so as I was saying, I haven't really talked about title tool much. So, which honestly seems to be like the bigger reservation. Like when you talk to people about why they won't switch to the new version, they're like, oh, because they don't have title tool anymore, which I understand, but it's like, I mean, I think the bigger thing is that the general perception, and in some ways it's very true, is that Titler Plus is problematic. So let's talk a little bit about title tool. So as I said before, title tool was a 32-bit. It was actually a separate application for Media Composer. It had the same icon, but if you ever, there was a question about Blackmagic Raw. I don't know what the situation is between Media Composer and between Avid and Blackmagic regarding Blackmagic Raw. I'm really not sure. I haven't heard anything about it. I'm not sure. It's a good question though. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and, okay. So as I was saying before, the title tool has actually always been a separate application from Media Composer. It's somewhere in the file system, but if you've ever noticed, when you open up the title tool and then you hit edit title, it actually opens a completely different program. And that program is what was 32-bit. And because of that, it doesn't run anymore. So on newer versions of Media Composer, if you get a sequence that let's say came from Media Composer, an older version of Media Composer, and has a bunch of titles in it that were generated with title tool, if those titles were rendered, or the media was created and you still have that media online, then those rendered titles that were generated by title tool can be read on Avid on new versions of macOS, but they can't be recreated or modified. So you can't, let's say that you have, you got this sequence and it's got a bunch of title tool titles in it. If you click, in and you try to edit that title, it will tell you the title tool is no longer supported. That's all it'll say. Another place where it might be nice if it told you what to do next, but that's why I'm here. So another thing to note is that you cannot recreate title media. So what you're used to doing is you get the sequence, it's all title tool titles, they're all offline. So what we're all used to doing is going up to the top, selecting it out and choosing recreate title media. Well, what recreate title media will do is it will try to use title tool. And so when you click that button, it will do nothing. So you might be frustrated to find out that you cannot recreate your titles. So what do? What you actually have to do is you have to select all of your titles and you have to right click on them and choose promote titles and then choose Avid Titler Plus. And what it will do is it will actually switch all of your titles from title tool to Titler Plus, which is good. The only problem is title tool and Titler Plus, as I spoke to Chris Beauvais, who I mentioned before, and I asked him why. Actually, I'll tell you what happens first. So if you have titles that, let's say, look like this, and you promote them to Titler Plus, what you'll end up with is something that looks completely different. And the reason for that is that title tool and Titler Plus deal with spatial organization completely differently. And so for the most part, what's going to come over is not so much the way that the titles looked or the organization, but the text. And because of that, you'll kind of have to go in and fix the titles once you upgrade them. Full disclosure, I've found that upgrading titles and then trying to modify them in Titler Plus is kind of super buggy. And so what I would recommend is do this. Take your titles, upgrade them, try to work with them, but keep in mind that it may be a mess because like the bounding boxes get all weird and like everything is in the wrong place and you try to move something and it doesn't move it the way you expect. And it's not because Titler Plus is just sucks, which a lot of people will tell you. What it is that the translation between the way the title tool read the titles and the way that Titler Plus reads the titles is not straightforward and doesn't work very well because they're completely different. So what I would recommend is if you have the time and you have the patience, try to recreate your titles with Titler Plus, because you will have a much less buggy and a much more future-proof solution. So that's sort of my rant on upgrading your titles. Okay, and another thing to note that's useful sometimes and frustrating sometimes is that legacy titles, as everybody knows, were generated as media. So you would actually, when you created your title, it would actually generate a file that would sit somewhere on a hard drive or on the Nexus. And let's say that you generated the file to your internal drive. If you gave that, or if someone else opened that sequence, then all of your titles would be offline, which was really frustrating. The new title, Titler Plus, now generates titles as effects, which is really convenient because that means that you don't have to worry about your titles being offline when somebody opens the sequence if you render or if you save them to the wrong place. But I'll get to the asterisk on that in just a minute. So let's talk about Titler Plus. So Titler Plus was introduced in Media Composer 2018.12. And it has support for titles larger than HD. But early versions of Titler Plus were extremely buggy. It was, I don't know the behind the scenes situation. I know that they had one team on it that sort of had a different vision for what it should be than what their vision really should have been. And because of that, the early versions of the software did things in very weird ways, were missing a lot of features and had lots of bugs. But Titler Plus has significantly changed and improved with every release of Media Composer, especially the last two, Media Composer 2022.4 and 2022.7 have made significant changes in Titler Plus. And if you used it, it's kind of like the Final Cut 10 situation. If you used it in early versions, give it another chance because a lot has changed. And there are still things about it that are buggy, which one of them being, and this is an acknowledged issue, unrendered titles actually continue to cause system performance issues. So if you have a bunch of titles in your timeline and you don't render them, it will actually slow down your system, which is kind of a big deal. But hopefully they'll get that resolved pretty quickly. But the Avid team, and I can tell you this because everybody I spoke to said this, the Avid team is working their asses off to fix Titler Plus. People complain about it ad nauseum, which is fine because, you know, it's very important software that needs to be rock solid. And it wasn't from the beginning. But What I don't want you to come away from this thinking is that it's not worth trying. It is worth trying. And I would say this of everything that you ever do. Just because someone says it doesn't work very well, don't take that at face value. Try it for yourself. And if it sucks, then don't use it. But also keep in mind that Avid comes out with a new version of the software every 3 months or so. And every time they release the software, it gets better. So every time I get a new version of Media Composer, I always try out Title Plus and see what they've changed, because it changes that much. And at this point, I'd say for 70% of our use, it works. The system performance issue is kind of a big deal. But the big workaround to all of this is that you can use subcaps instead of Titler Plus. So if you have a sequence with a bunch of titles in it and you're not doing anything fancy, you're just doing, let's say, like temp lower thirds, because real lower thirds are going to get done in online or as Mac keys graphics, and maybe like a slate. Do it with a subcap, because subcaps are super stable. They're also effects, so you don't have to worry about media, and subcaps are rock solid. So that's my 2 cents on that. Okay, so everything we've covered so far has been specifically in reference to Media Composer, but there's also QuickTime in the larger sense. Like, it was always nice on a Mac to just be able to open everything with QuickTime Player. Like, I know there are a lot of people who are sad because QuickTime Player doesn't work anymore. So what are your options there? Like, if you're outside of Avid and you get media and you want to open it up, do you have to download VLC? So let's talk about that for a little. Okay, so QuickTime options. So beginning with Catalina, QuickTime Player on macOS supports timecode and JKL playback. So if you're on macOS Catalina or later, and you open up a file, you will notice that if the file has if it has timecode, the timecode will show up in the lower left, which is awesome. It took them a long time to add that functionality, but it's great that it's there. And you also have support for JKL playback. So if you want to, play forward, play reverse, pause, all that kind of stuff, you can do that with your JKL playback. There's also a function to go to a timecode, which is super useful. So if you go up to, I don't know, like somewhere in the menu bar, you can choose go to timecode, and you can type in a timecode and it will jump you to that timecode. But you might say, well, that's great, but QuickTime doesn't support anything except for ProRes and H.264 and H.265. And you're right, out of the box, it doesn't. But there is actually a separate download that's completely free from Apple called Pro Video Formats that you can download from the internet right now that will add the ability to QuickTime Player in macOS to watch DNX and a couple other file formats in QuickTime, modern QuickTime. Of all of this stuff, I feel like this is one of the things that's least widely known. And one of the things that's super awesome about this is that about 8 years ago, Apple added support for MXFs in QuickTime. And because of that, QuickTime Player in modern macOS with the Apple Pro Video Formats package can actually play back MXFs with Quick Look, including files in your Avid Media Files folder. Like, how cool is that? That's pretty awesome. So I would say, in my opinion, as far as the playback functions with the Pro Video Formats download, QuickTime, it used to be called QuickTime 10, now it's just called QuickTime Player because there isn't any other version of QuickTime anymore, is a worthy replacement for QuickTime 7, not so much QuickTime Pro. So what about if you want to use a third-party program as a video player? So some of the options are VLC, which is free, but as far as I know, doesn't really have good support for timecode, and doesn't have JKL. Telestream Switch, which is actually really good as well, but is paid. And then Screen, which is another one that's also great, but that one is also paid software. And I actually emailed them when I like a couple weeks ago and told them I would be mentioning their software in this class and asked if I could have a discount code. So if you find that Screen looks like a really cool program and you want to buy it, then email me and I'll send you the discount code that they gave me. So what about the functionality that you had in QuickTime Pro? Well, unfortunately, QuickTime Player, for things like trimming, QuickTime Player is still not great because, and I tested this for this class, if you try to trim something in QuickTime Player, it doesn't tell you time codes. So it's not really ideal for trimming. But fortunately, over the past couple of years, another awesome program has come on the market that allows you to do everything you could do in QuickTime Pro, as far as I know, and more, which is a free program called Shutter Encoder. So Shutter Encoder will allow you to trim. It'll allow you to cut out portions of files. It'll allow you to view QuickTime metadata, all kinds of awesome stuff. So between QuickTime Player with the Pro Video formats and Shutter Encoder, you can recreate pretty much all of the QuickTime functionality that you lost with QuickTime 7. If you want to do something a little more intense, like let's say replacing media in a file, another option, which is paid and a little more pricey, is actually you can use, there's a company called CineX, well, it's called Cinedeck, but they make two pieces of software called CineX Tools and CineX Meta that allow you to either modify the metadata in a QuickTime without re-encoding it, or even drop in video into a QuickTime without re-encoding, which can be extremely useful. So I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I've told you a lot of stuff that might kind of dissuade you from making this switch. Like, there's a lot of things to do to make your workflow work on a new Mac. So maybe you should just stick with what you have. You know, maybe you have like a 2013 trash can Mac Pro. Like, is it really worth it to make this switch to a newer version of macOS? So let's take a look at that. So there's a lot of ways that you can quantify a computer, but arguably the best way to do that is by looking at CPU performance, and that's the performance of the processor in that computer. So if we look at the processors of some of the computers over the past couple of years, there's something that becomes pretty apparent. So this is based on Geekbench 5 CPU scores. So at the top, we have the 2013 Mac Pro, which everyone's probably familiar with, which retailed for about this configuration that I'm referring to, retailed for about $7,000. And the Geekbench is basically it's a way of measuring CPU performance, and it's broken up into single core performance, which is the performance when you're using one core of the computer, which would be, you know, for anything that's not multi-threaded. So basic stuff like web browsing, basically anything outside of like video editing where you're using multiple CPU cores. So the single core on the 2013 Mac Pro was 728, and the multi-core was around 7,000. The Intel 18-core iMac Pro that came out in 2017 Jump that up to about 13.5 for the multi-core, and for almost the same money. Granted, this is about 4 years later, so you know, we should see significantly better performance. And then if we look at the Mac Mini that came out in 2018, it was about $1,200 and arguably faster than the 2013 Mac Pro. I mean, as far as multi-core CPU scores, it's not quite as good, but it's getting up there. So then we have the Return to Tower Mac Pro, which came out in 2019. If we look at the 28 core version of that, which actually retails, they still sell it for $13,000, a huge jump there. So we have a multi-core CPU score of 20,000. So this is, looking at this, this is the before Apple made the transition. And you can see all of these are sort of, you know, you get a sense for what you get for your money. The Mac Mini, which came out in 2018, definitely seems like the best deal here. And I also want to address that, you know, obviously everybody who's here, you know, likes Macs and probably uses a Mac. But a lot of people say that you're not getting what you pay for in terms of value. And with Intel CPUs, I generally would usually, like, personally, I love macOS and I would pay for a Mac even if it costs more than a Windows machine. With Intel CPUs, I would agree. You really weren't, you know, you were paying a lot more and getting the same performance as a cheaper PC. But things have really changed since Apple switched to their own architecture. The M1 Mac Mini, which was came out along with the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro in 2020. It costs a mere $699 and bests the Intel 2013 Mac Pro significantly, and is almost twice as fast in terms of single core scores. That's a $700 computer, and it's faster than the Mac Pro that's sitting on your desk. That's pretty good. And then if we look at the Mac Studio that came out this year, the M1 Mac Studio retails for about $2,000 and is almost as fast. It's actually faster in single core and is almost as fast in multi-core as the iMac Pro that came out 5 years ago that costs over $7,000. That kind of blows you away. I mean, that's pretty crazy in my opinion. And then if we look at the highest end, the M1 Ultra Mac Studio, you're paying $4,000 and you're getting a computer that's faster than a $13,000 Mac Pro. That's amazing. So your bang for your buck on a Mac has drastically increased with the switch to Apple Silicon. And also, a lot of the pain points, in my opinion, on macOS over the past 10 years have been because of the situation that Apple was in with Intel. There was a lot of controversy over the 2016 MacBook Pro that came out, where I believe it maxed out at 16 gigs of RAM, which at the time still felt really small. I'm not trying to, excuse Apple from that, but the reason for that was because they couldn't put any more RAM in it because of limitations on Intel processors. And there have been several things like that where Apple has hit ceilings because of issues that Intel has had. And I don't want to be too hard on Intel, but for comparison, I looked at, we're talking about Macs here, but Macs aren't the only computers in the world. In fact, they're actually a very small portion of the computers in the world. most of them run Windows. So what about if we look at systems that run Windows? So I went on to HP's website and I pulled up a Z8 because the Z8 G4 is sort of the standard for a workstation Windows system. And the base configuration HP Z8 G4 was $3,800. And I looked at the processor and I looked up the processor on Geekbench and I was shocked. The processor that ships with this computer gets these Geekbench results. Like, what? Are you kidding me? This is a machine that's running a processor that's worse than the 2013 Mac Pro. And I'm not saying that's the only processor you can get, but that's the processor that you start with. And that's also just the HP Z8 G4. There's also, that's running an older Intel processor. Intel now has significantly faster processors than that. But again, the bang for your buck is still not quite as good. So if you talk to somebody about processors, they're going to say that all of the innovation is happening on the AMD side. So I wanted to throw in an AMD processor to give you a little bit of context. And the HP Z8 G4 is a workstation system. And arguably you are paying extra for the fact that it's a workstation system. So I wanted to put in a system that was not a workstation system and didn't have that extra sort of workstation tax. So I looked at the Razer R1, which is Razer's gaming PC with an AMD Ryzen 9 CPU. The Ryzen 9, this system comes in at 1670 on single core and 13958 on multi-core. That's pretty damn good. But the price of this system is $3,500. If you look at the Mac Studio, it gets faster single core, it gets slightly slower multi-core, but it's $1,500 less. And if you want something faster than the Razer R1, then you can go with the Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra for $4,000, and the multi-core is almost twice as fast. That's kind of crazy. I mean, there's this, in my opinion, says a lot about the way things are changing with Apple's switch to Apple Silicon processors. And there's sort of an elephant in the room here, which is GPU, because I'm not talking about GPU speeds, but there's also very little, and you can ask Avid about this, there's very little utilization of the GPU in Media Composer. Media Composer uses the GPU for, I believe, mostly for effects, transcoding, exporting, all of that stuff is CPU bound. It's all done on the CPU. Another thing to keep in mind, there's a question that I'll come back to in just a minute. Another thing to keep in mind is that, I just lost my train of thought. Shucks. Oh, yes. Another thing to keep in mind is that, as I said before, Media Composer is not yet Avid native. And what that means is that while these numbers are very impressive, they will not be reflected in Media Composer because you are technically still running the application through a translation layer. So if you buy one of these systems, it probably will not reflect these numbers right now. But once optimizations are done in Media Composer to take advantage of the new Apple Silicon architecture, hopefully, Avid is not nearly as good as other programs at doing this, But hopefully you will see this kind of difference. Another thing to note is that M1 Pro, M1 Max, M1 Ultra, and M2 processors all include hardware video decoders and encoders for H.264, H.265, and ProRes. And those decoders, although they're hardware decoders on the Windows side, they're nowhere near as strong or as powerful as the ones that are in these new Apple chips. Granted, I don't think Avid's using any of that stuff, but if you ever do anything in Resolve, for example, Resolve on even my laptop, which is a M1 Max 14-inch MacBook Pro, kills it. It's amazing, extremely fast, because it takes advantage of all of this stuff. So that's sort of my thought on the situation. So next I'm going to move on to suggestions. There is a question that I'll quickly answer. So the question is, if I have a timeline from an old project with media that has been linked with the QuickTime plugin, is there no way to relink it in a new version? If the durations are different, it will not be linked, right? Any method to be able to recover those old projects? So yes, if you are on a new version of Media Composer and you have a bin of media that was linked in an older version of Media Composer, you will have to create new links, and anything with, let's say, a different duration or where something significant varies likely will not relink. What I would suggest is, if you have a situation like that, if at all possible, go back to the old version of Avid and link and consolidate that media, or link and transcode that media. If you can't do that, then unfortunately, yeah, or actually, I mean, you could also do it on a PC, a system running Windows, where you have access to the QuickTime plugin. But if you can't do that, yes, your only option would be to create new links, relink to those new links, and then consolidate or transcode, and probably have to shot check in the process, because technically it's not the same link. Okay, so that answers that question. Any other questions before I move on to my suggestions for dealing with switching between Media Composer versions? Okay. All right. So let's talk about suggestions. So if you know that you're going to be making the switch, which is great, it's fantastic. You should at some point. What I would suggest, number one, do not switch mid-project. If you're working on a project in 2018, finish the project in 2018. Get the project in 2018 to a point where you can read it in 2020 or 2022. So finish the project, consolidate your media, make sure all your titles are rendered or that you have media created for them, save it on a drive, and upgrade your system. You can always go back to that project and reference it later, but do not take a project that you're working on in 2018 and try to finish it in a newer version of Media Composer. I mean, if you really need to, as long as you don't have linked media, you can do it, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you are going to be upgrading, and let's say you're starting a new project, if you're going to be working with other people, number one, I would recommend find out what version of Avid and what OS other editors and assists are using. So this is if you're supplying your own system. If you're working on Jump, or if you're working in the office, they probably have something for you. But if you're providing your own machine, find out what everybody else is working on. If you're working on the newer version of Media Composer and everybody else is, let's say you're working on a new Mac and everyone else is on the newest version of Avid, but they're on Windows. So actually, sorry, let me back up. So I've broken this down into how concerned you should be depending on the setup. So I would say that if everyone is on macOS Catalina and later running the current version of Media Composer, you have nothing to worry about, because no one in that circle of people could do anything that anybody else could not read, because everybody is equally unable to do the problematic things that you would deal with in this situation. So question was asked, what about switching from Media Composer 21.6 to 21.12 mid-project on macOS Catalina? If you're currently on macOS Catalina and you're switching from 21.6 to 21.12, that's fine. The bigger concern, in my opinion, is not so much the version of Avid, it's the version of macOS. Because if you're already on the newest version of macOS, then you already got all of these headaches and things can only get better. If you're on an older version of macOS where you don't have these headaches, like you have, access to QuickTime and the Title Tool, and you switch, you've got a lot of stuff to get used to and a lot of stuff to figure out. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Okay, so. All right, so I would say that that's the situation where you really have nothing to worry about. So less concerning, I would say, is if you have a combo of current macOS and current Windows running current Avid. If this is the situation, I would say the things that you have to look out for, any MOV and MP4 files that are linked via QuickTime on the Windows system won't be able to be read on the Mac. I didn't say this in here, but if you've linked stuff on your Mac, the Windows machine will be able to read them because they're UME links, which Avid on Windows can read. And any titles generated via Title Tool on that Windows system can't be modified or recreated on a Mac. So if a title needs to be modified and you're on the Mac, you'd probably have to upgrade the title to Titler Plus, make the modification, and then either overcut it later with the original title, or just let the other editor know that you've upgraded the title and now they have to work in Titler Plus. Potentially problematic would be a combo of current macOS running current Avid and older macOS and or Windows running 2018 or older. And what I would say about how to approach that situation is that the systems running the older version of Avid should be on the latest patch update. So if you're running Media Composer 2018-12, make sure you're on 2018-12. I think 15 is the newest one, because Avid adds things like the DNX header thing that I was talking about. Avid adds things in the newer versions of Media Composer that it then adds compatibility to in patches to the older versions of Media Composer. So it really helps if you're working between the two, if everyone is on the newest patch update. If mixing versions, the things that I would recommend and the things that will prevent you from running into headaches. Number one, no linked MOV or MP4 files should be exchanged. Always consolidate or transcode your footage before handing off. If media is brought in via QuickTime, keep in mind that your upres may need to be done on a system with QuickTime, and the same is true with UME. If you bring in footage via UME, you may need to do the upres on a system with UME. All titles should be rendered before your handoff. This is true with Media Composer 2018.12 for sure. So if you're on a system with Title Tool and you're handing your sequence off to somebody who's on a newer version of macOS, you definitely want to make sure that all of your titles are created, that there's media for them. If you're on a newer version of Avid and you create something with Titler Plus and you hand it off to somebody on 2018-12, technically they'll be able to read the title and they'll actually be able to modify it, but it's still probably best that you render before handing it off. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I have, except for I've got a quick resources page, which actually I'll bring up right now. So in prepping this, I wanted everybody to have an idea of where they could find out more about this information. So I've placed in here links to different things that I found helpful. Number one, not related to Media Composer, but in reference to the whole QuickTime situation. Macworld wrote an article back in 2018 on QuickTime and the removal of QuickTime and what led up to it and all of that kind of information, a lot of the stuff that I covered at the beginning. And you can read that. That's the one at the top. On the right, I've added QR codes. So if you pick up your phone and you just hold it right here, all of these QR codes, you should just be able to tap them and it'll take you to these websites. The second one is probably the most helpful one, because it is Avid's official explanation of this situation. And it's basically the only widely available documentation on all of the stuff that I've covered. And it was written when Media Composer 2020.4 came out. So some of the information in there has changed, not a lot, but some of the information in there has changed, but it can also clarify some of the questions that you may have. I tried to cover everything, but if you have like specific situations, this article by Avid is very interesting, and it also explains, their process, how they created UME, how they rolled it out, all that kind of stuff. The third one is just a list by Avid of all of the types of files that are supported without Media Composer installed, or sorry, without QuickTime installed. The next one actually is from a guy named Jack Brown, I believe, who was super awesome. I sent him an early version, well, not that early, maybe a week and a half ago, of this slideshow, and he gave me feedback. He's the reason that I knew that you could batch import PNG sequences. So thank you very much, Jack. And he has a great YouTube channel called the Avid Assistant. And he by far has the best video for anybody moving to the new version of Media Composer who, number one, is not familiar with this situation. He doesn't cover it in anywhere near the kind of depth that I have, but he does explain, the new export and linking functions. And more than anything, he talks about the new interface, how to change it, how to deal with it, and how to embrace it. Because it's actually, personally, I don't know that I prefer it one way or another, but you can make the new interface feel much more like the old interface if you'd like to do that. And he also explains just how to use it the way that it's intended as well. Great video. And if you're making the switch, I couldn't recommend that video highly enough. And then the last thing is actually a questionnaire that my wife helped me put together for this class. I wanted to get an idea from everybody of how helpful you found all this information. If there's anything else that you wanted to know that wasn't included. So if you go to the link at the very bottom, that is a quick questionnaire that will sort of helps me get an idea of how everybody felt about the class, how useful, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I've got 2 questions currently. Number one, what's my email? So, sorry, I was spacing out thinking about whether this is being recorded. I'm pretty sure it is. Let me just double check that. Yes. Okay, good. It is indeed being recorded. Okay. What is my email? So go ahead and send me an email at assistbootcamp@gmail.com. I'll just put it in the chat here. And if you send me an email, I will shoot you the slides, but also in your email, please just like maybe introduce yourself, like tell me what you thought of the class, what your situation is and what you plan on doing with the information. Just sort of, give me some context. That'd be awesome. If you don't, I'll still send you the slides, but that would be really nice. And it looks like that's all of the questions we had. So we're pretty much done. If there's anything else that anybody wants to know, I'm happy to demo it in Avid. Or if there are other questions, please just let me know now. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions. All right, great. Okay, well, thank you to everyone. Thank you very much. As I said, I created this slideshow like 3 years ago, and there's a lot of info in here that was hard to come across. So I hope that you guys found it helpful. Please, if you have an opportunity, do that questionnaire, so that I can find out, how everybody enjoyed the class and what they're, what they're going to use this info for. Otherwise, I look forward to working with everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you very much.